This is Voices for Climate, the podcast where activists, scientists, innovators, and everyday people speak out for the planet. If you're looking for honest conversations, bold ideas, and real climate solutions, you're in the right place. My name is Arnav, and today we're joined by Eric Havel. Eric is the Environmental and Climate Literacy Coordinator for Community Resources for Science. He creates and facilitates climate literacy programs for students and teachers in the Bay Area. He earned a degree in environmental science from UC Berkeley and has over 30 years of experience in science education. He also coordinates the annual Bay Area Climate Literacy Exchange, where educators, students, and community partners share best practices in climate literacy education. Moreover, he helped lead the development of a fourth grade climate science and environmental justice unit that is used by educators throughout California. Eric, it's great to have you here.
Thanks so much, Arnav, for having me. Looking forward to speaking with you today.
Yeah, so to start off, can you maybe share what drew you to climate activism?
Sure. Yeah, it really was in my college years that I kind of focused in on this area of topic and interest in sort of study and sort of my life's work. There was two pivotal moments. One was I learned about climate change in the late 80s, early 90s. Al Gore was raising awareness among other politicians and sort of environmentalists. And the second was that, in the Bay Area, we have something called a Mediterranean climate, which is characterized by cool, wet winters, warm, dry summers. And so I was wondering, what does that mean for our climate if it's going to start to change? Are we going to get drier? Are we going to get wetter? But also, I learned at the same time in a geography class in my sophomore year that there's other Mediterranean climate zones across the world, four other ones, and that fascinated me. And it also concerned me because they're like our climate siblings, our brothers and sisters across the world that have similar climates, beautiful places to live, breadbaskets for the world, but also at risk of climate change. So it got
Mhm.
me thinking, not only are we going to be impacted, but globally, there's other places in the world, including our climate siblings, but also what can we do about it? How can we help out? How can we help out those that are most sort of in need and marginalized and
Right.
most heavily impacted by climate change?
hmm Yeah, that makes sense. And so, kind of what drew you to education and climate literacy specifically?
I think I come from a sort of a history and a family of educators. My dad was a high school teacher. My mom was really an educator at heart, even though she didn't sort of teach formally in schools. She was like the neighborhood, the mother of what growing up. I was an only child, but our house was the magnet for all the kids in the neighborhood. And she was sort of an educator to many of my friends, who I still have friends, today. And so I think education was sort of in my blood, and I just think it's really important to a lot of folks don't understand the complexities of climate change, why it's happening, how it's happening, what we can do about it. So sharing, I kind of think of it as like science communication. It's its own area of skill and its own, and there's a great need for it just because of the complexity and multifaceted nature of climate change.
Yeah, I know that definitely makes sense. Can you dive deeper then into your role, the community resources for science, and kind of what does a climate literacy coordinator entail?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I'm really enjoying my role with Community Resources for Science. I've partnered and been involved with Community Resources for Science for over, gosh, it's probably been about 20 years. Formally, I've been working with the group for 5 years. Prior to that, I worked 22 years at a science center called Chabot Space and Science Center, doing science education, a lot focused on environmental literacy, environmental programs, sustainability, climate change education, everything from student-facing programs to teacher training programs to public programs. And I'm doing similar work with CRS that I sort of carried from the Chabot years, in that I'm developing and delivering climate literacy programs for, I like to call it K to gray. So for all the way from the littlest students all the way up to seniors, and just depends on the audience and the need. But it's really facilitating programs to raise awareness about climate change and climate and environmental justice, which is another really emerging area of climate literacy education that really attends to those that are most, vulnerable and uh, those that have been marginalized in society, so that we have the sensibility of helping out, everyone that's in need, but also those that are most in need. So I think CRS, we develop these programs, we deliver these programs to students and to teachers. We do a lot of resource connecting
Mhm.
too. And in addition to developing our own programs, we'll connect the teachers to resources across the Bay Area.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. I like the way you put it, kind of K to gray, because it shows, how climate literacy isn't just for some people, it's really for everyone. And I think it's a sort of communal effort. But I'm curious, how do you think, especially younger children, like, kindergartners, or, you develop the curriculum for fourth graders, how do you think they sort of perceive climate literacy and climate education compared to maybe older students, like middle schoolers or high schoolers?
That's a great question. And I think, there's a number of things, right? There's what's written into our formal educational standards, things like the next generation science standards or,
Right.
math, literacy standards, history, social science. So there's kind of what we know through our formal sort of identification of the key things to cover at certain ages and certain grade levels, certain points in youth development. But there's also like the emotional side of it. Young
Mhm.
students, especially A, won't have the capacity to understand the whole system. Like, what is climate change? Why is it happening? And it's not, I think, as important to share those things at like, with a first grader or a second grader. It's more important to give them the foundational knowledge. Things like how everyday living does have an impact on our climate. Things like, growing your own food or composting or recycling. At the youngest of ages, I think getting students to engage in those environmental and sustainability practices sets them up for kind of getting prepared for understanding how those things connect. When they get into the upper elementary grades, middle and high school, you start to think about systems. You start to think about how things all fit
Yeah,
together. You also start to think about yourself personally, and how you
right.
can have an impact. And I think you don't want to instill fear with the youngest students. You want to
Mhm.
instill resilience and empowerment, and the ability from the beginning that there's many things and ways that we can live and messages that we can send to our community
Mhm.
about living in a sustainable, positive way that then, like I said earlier, sets us up and sets students up for success as they start to think about, well, now I need to think bigger. Now I need to think about not only my own actions, but what's happening in the world and where are the leverage points, where are the places that I really want to focus my attention in addition to things that I can do within my own spheres of influence.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And I kind of agree with what you're saying. If we teach these students habits early, like composting or recycling, then that definitely carries on, later in life. So I want to ask you more about the Bay Area Climate Literacy Exchange. Can you explain to us what that is, what the planning process is, kind of behind it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really exciting event that we've held two events so far. This is an annual event that typically takes place in the late winter, early spring. The first year we had about 120, 130 participants, and these were mainly teachers. So it's a teacher-focused event, but not a teacher-exclusive
Mhm.
event. So we also invite students to come. We invite district administrators and community partners like my organization, and others like Stop Waste and Chabot and others to be involved in a conversation with each other. And as the name sort of suggests, it's an exchange of ideas around climate literacy education across, especially East Bay. So I'd say Alameda County centric with participation from many other counties in the Bay Area. And the second annual event was last year, and we had about 190 participants. So it's definitely grown. Um, and we're really trying to like look at district by district, school by school, who's doing what, and what are the best practices that, let's say, a Berkeley school or a Berkeley district is engaging in, that district can then share with Oakland or Fremont or Hayward or Livermore. Others that have formal resolutions. So about seven districts across the Bay Area have what they call a climate literacy resolution at the board level within the school district, which means that they are on board and they are requiring climate literacy to be taught across the K to 12 spectrum. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's happening because a resolution doesn't necessarily come tied with resources. And so there's other things like board policies and administrative actions that actually tie the board, ties money and resources behind those resolutions. So those are sort of the next tier steps that districts can take. So, like I said earlier, if Berkeley is engaging in some of those things and has been successful, that's something that other districts and schools can learn from. So it's been some really exciting conversation. We've held it for the last 2 years at the Chabot Space and Science Center, which, I mentioned I worked for years and still have a relationship and do some part-time work with. So it's been a great event, and I just encourage any of the listeners today to reach out. It's to you or to myself. Would be glad to share more information about that. We're anticipating it'll take place in 2026 in sometime January through March. We haven't quite identified the date for that yet.
Hmm. Yeah, that sounds like a, really great event. Do you have any like maybe stories that are particularly memorable from the event that you'd like to share?
You sure, sure. Yeah, so numerous things. One was my colleague, her name is Nancy Wright at the Hayward Unified School District. She came the first year, and her role within the district in part is to drive climate literacy for the entire district. And so she's done a lot of foundational work to build that capacity for her district. And when she came to the event, she got so excited that when she went back, she and her colleagues worked with students and worked with their district to actually write to the board and essentially write that they want a climate resolution at the board level, at the district level. And 6 months after that event, they got a resolution written. So it inspired her so much to be there that their district, I think, became the fourth or fifth district in the Alameda County to actually get a resolution on the books as a result. The other was another one that comes to mind was last year we had a keynote speaker from Fremont, the Fremont School District, who just spoke about his climate literacy, climate justice in particular. Again, we talked about the idea of attending to the most vulnerable members of our society that potentially at most at risk from climate change. And he spoke to that. He spoke to his work in waste diversion, recycling, and it was very inspiring to have that youth voice sort of represented. Because that's what, at the end of the day, that's what we as an educational community are there for, are the students, and really to support them to share our ideas. And I think, a lot of times we'll talk about passing the baton to the youth, but I like to think of it really now more as carrying the baton together because it's a big burden to say, you all as young people need to solve this problem. We can't do it as older folks, but that's really not true. We're all in this together and we have an opportunity to learn and hear from each other and work on this huge topic together. So that's what excites me about that event is it does bring together, it's a multi-generational event. It's different fields coming together to really work and move the needle on climate education. And I think the Bay Area is definitely a leader in this space.
Hmm. Yeah, that's great to hear. And I like the way you put it, that it's kind of like a collective effort and that we're all in it together. I think that's really important and something that I think people, at least that I've interacted with, don't really understand. You mentioned these climate resolutions that I kind of want to ask you about now. So, you mentioned that some of these resolutions, like many districts have passed resolutions, but some of them aren't necessarily in effect. Can you explain, why these resolutions aren't working? Kind of, what's the barrier with these resolutions?
I think it's that's they're meant to sort of set the goalposts for a district. They sort of set aspirationally what a district wants to do, but they don't often come tied with connections to resources. So examples would be, you know, uh, professional development programs for teachers to begin to really understand how to incorporate climate literacy topics and tenets into their curriculum. Uh, Identified staff members to drive the effort, right? So if you've got a
Hmm.
resolution, but you've got nobody that's sort of helping to guide and lead the effort, then it's not going to move forward as quickly. So an example of a sort of a couple positive examples of folks that have districts that have connected resources to the effort are Fremont Unified and Berkeley Unified both have positions that their central role is to drive sustainability and climate literacy education across their districts. So they organize groups, teams of teachers, they meet regularly, they strategize, and so these are paid roles within the districts. And other districts in the East Bay are lacking that role. So I think that, and then as we know, education is often financially um, it's challenging, right? In an environment of scarcity of resources, budget constraints, a lot of districts have budget shortfalls, budget deficits. So if anything, they're looking to cut positions. And we talk about something like climate literacy, becomes a tertiary priority because I would say math and language are first, and then we see maybe science and social science coming in second. for districts as far as priorities and what they need to be teaching, what teachers are required to teach. But then climate literacy is really a multidisciplinary uh, program and topic to cover. It requires understanding from the sciences, from the social sciences, the ability to communicate effectively, which is language arts. So all that to be said, it's difficult for teachers to grasp bringing in something more to their curriculum. So to develop tools that show them that really by teaching climate science and climate literacy and climate justice, it's an integrative strategy that actually enables you to teach all those different disciplines. So it's not that you have to do it in place of something, it's you're doing it and you're meeting the standards that you need to be meeting officially.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And so, you kind of mentioned how, like before, you mentioned how there's sort of a wide variety of people that kind of come to, whether it's like the climate literacy exchange or, the people you interact with, obviously a very diverse set of people. And so, how do you approach teaching about climate change in communities, for instance, that may be politically or culturally divided on the issue?
That's a great question, and it is a challenge in these times, especially given our sort of the national landscape and the political landscape being so polarized, you know.
Yeah.
And I like to start from a position of listening with anybody that I talk to, as opposed to sort of saying this is what we should be doing, this is what we have to be doing. It's like listening first. What is your perspective? Why do you believe what you believe? We have everything from the dismissive of climate change to the alarmist. There's been a whole set of studies that's done by a group called the Yale uh, Program on Climate Change. They've
Mm,
done kind of studies year after year looking at where our public is with respect to climate change
mm,
and their sort of opinion on how serious it is. And the needle's definitely been moving towards the more and more towards the this is a really big problem that we need to be addressing. But by listening first and understanding people's perspectives, you can find entry points for collaboration. For example,
mm,
a lot of folks are on board with the concept of energy independence, right? We don't want to be dependent on other nations, other sources of energy. If we can internally generate the energy we need to run our society and our everything that we need, then it's this idea of independence, and that theme resonates with just about everybody that I talk to,
mm,
that I work with. And then it's a question of, okay, well, what does that mean? Does that mean we need to go, drill from, more oil or mine for more coal? Or does it mean we need to deploy more solar panels, wind power? And so I think then that's the conversation. And then I think sometimes people get too locked into the idea of climate change as a political topic and a political issue, as opposed to it sort of being a scientific. And it's just,
mm,
empirically, the data shows us that it's happening, and it's largely as a result of human actions. And so if you really look at the science and you look at the data, you really can't deny that. And so I think if you can start with some of the facts and look at the data and then have those productive conversations, it can lead to collaborative, productive actions that we can take together. So that's my hope, is through listening, through understanding the science, and then also really paying attention to, again, the folks that are most marginalized in our communities. We saw this during COVID, right? We saw how important our frontline workers were, all those in the medical profession, our nurses, because they were taking care of the basic needs of our society. They were giving us access to food, to healthcare, to the vaccines, to the practices that we needed to have in place to be safe. And so it got a lot of us thinking about the most vulnerable in our society, and that really transfers over to climate change, I think, very well. And that there's folks that don't have the resources to navigate when we have extreme weather things like droughts or extreme temperatures in the Central Valley, for example, or too much rain, right? Atmospheric rivers. Those that don't have the ability to navigate through, having air conditioning or having an adequate supply of food or access to food become more vulnerable and become. So I think, just attending to that and making folks aware of those that have less than others of us have.
Yeah, no, that approach definitely makes a lot of sense. I think sounds like something effective and people should try to incorporate. And so, When it comes to then climate education, in your opinion, what would you consider as success?
That's a great question too. I think success would be different teachers at different levels feeling confident that they have the tools and knowledge and abilities and resources to teach what they need to be teaching, and want to be teaching. Not just need to be, but want to be, because I think there's a lot of folks that in this space that are the leaders because they are pushing. They're pushing to get climate literacy built in to their curriculum. So I think feeling that confidence and feeling that support as an educator, that's like paramount, and that support can come from colleagues, it can come from the voices of their students, and can come from administration, and is paired with these community partners that can often bring extra resources into the conversation and to the literacy space. So that teacher that's able to navigate and pull in resources and move forward, I think that to me is success. And then seeing what students do with that information. I think some of the exciting things that I see happening now in the space are similar to what you're doing as a young person with this podcast effort, is young people uh, taking on leadership roles in this space, really saying, hey, I'm not just learning, but I have ideas as a leader, and I think fostering that, serving as allies with our youth. There's been, in addition to this Bay Area Climate Summit, which I mentioned is teacher facing, there are youth climate summits in the Bay Area too that take place on an annual basis. And those are youth-driven symposiums that focus on the same topic, but from a youth perspective, and definitely they bring in teachers in the same way that the teacher-facing event, we want student voice, we want to collaborate. Similarly with those youth summits, youth focused, but very collaborative in nature. So that's, I think, giving students agency, listening, empowering students to take the actions that they feel compelled and they feel are urgent to be taking. That's huge.
Hmm. Yeah. And so, you mentioned kind of how there's a need for these teachers to feel supported. And, given some of the things like climate resolutions that have been passed by some districts, at least in the Bay Area, do you think that schools are doing enough right now, or do you think that there's more that needs to be done?
It's a great question. I always say that we're doing a tremendous amount, but there's always a need to do more. So
Of
for
course,
example,
yeah.
7 districts in the county now have climate resolutions, which leaves 11 that don't. So there's an opportunity, like just to get, and again, like we talked about, resolutions don't mean it's going to happen the week later
Right.
in that they're passed,
Hmm.
but it does set that goalpost for action. And the more, it's kind of like you probably heard these stories about, initially when solar panels were, people were putting them on roofs, they're like, well, that's weird. That's messing with my house. It makes it look weird. But then when folks start to see it happening across their neighborhood, they really start thinking, gosh, maybe I should be doing this. This may be important. And then they have those conversations with their neighbors. Oh, I'm saving energy. I'm saving money on my bill. I'm not contributing to as much greenhouse gas emissions because I have this renewable source of energy on my roof. Same with climate literacy. Like if other districts are doing it and they're getting excited about it, it starts to propel that movement forward. So I'm really hopeful
Yeah.
this year that we'll have global participation in the literacy exchange from all 18 districts, and that we'll be able to tell the discrete story of each of those districts. Like what's really happening in Berkeley? What's really happening in Oakland? And how do those districts cross over and help each other out so that we're all moving forward? It's not about who's doing best, right? It's about sharing best practices so that we
Yeah.
all collectively are moving in that direction. So, um, that excites me, and I think we're sort of reaching that place. By the way, there was a assembly bill passed that requires climate literacy education from first, I believe, through 12th grade, starting with science. It needs to be taught in science. Again, as a state mandate, it's almost like a state resolution for climate change. Again, it's on the books, doesn't mean it's necessarily happening, but it's setting the goalpost. And it is becoming an incentive. Because that bill was passed, districts are starting to go, well, how do I meet that requirement? How do I do that? So when you have these goalposts and these resolutions and assembly bills and um uh you know, it does really help to drive things, and it helps to motivate, right? And because then you have some justification to then later start to tie resources to those goals and to those requirements.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And I also hope that one day we're able to get to a point where these districts in the Bay Area and even beyond the Bay Area eventually implement these resolutions and maybe even tie funding to these resolutions. And so, with that in mind about what you said of what these districts can do more, I guess my last question to you then is what advice would you give to young people who are looking to start in climate work, especially, maybe at their district trying to help advocate for maybe resolutions to be passed?
That's a fantastic question, and there's some great work specifically happening in this space. There's a nonprofit called 10 Strands, which
Mhm.
does statewide work on building environmental literacy and has many different programs, which they were the ones that drove that K-12 climate literacy curriculum called Seeds to
Mhm.
Solutions. Was a result of a large-scale grant that San Mateo County Office of Education got. And then 10 Strands became the primary investigator, PI on the project, and then got the curriculum written. And our group, CRS, was responsible for the fourth grade. They also have another program called the CYCP program, which is basically working with youth to train them and to build their skills and becoming communicators and advocates for um, climate literacy education. So the idea is we work with them and I'm serving as a mentor for my second volunteer mentor position as my second cohort of three students. And I think there's about, I don't know, 50 to 60 students in the program statewide. And what we do is work with those youth throughout the semester, the fall semester, to build their skills and understanding of the state ecosystem, educational ecosystem. Like what does it mean to have a board, and what does it mean to have a school district, and what is a resolution versus a, administrative action or board policy, and then looking at their schools and their districts in particular to find out, well, what's happening with respect to climate literacy in my district, and where is the opportunity to do more, like you just asked, where is the opportunity? And then the youth identify that thing that they want. We need to get our recycling system really dialed in. It's not happening. It's not working. We need to, really hone in on getting our kindergarten through fifth grade climate literacy connected and adjacent curriculum together. We're not doing it right. So then that youth goes to the board and advocates for that through an in-person, board presentation. They've put together this comprehensive, uh, slide deck or set of information presentation that they give to the board saying, "Hey, we love what's happening in the district, but we want to do more." This specifically is what we need. And me as a young person, from my perspective, as a young person, this is what I think is most important to get us to move forward. So it's a very powerful program that does help students really feel that give them that confidence that they can go and speak in front of their board. And many of the resolutions, by the way, were passed because of this exact thing, because youth went to the board and said, this needs to be happening. This is urgent. This is really important. And as a result, Oakland passed a resolution, Hayward passed a resolution, Fremont passed a resolution, all with youth involved. So youth voice is huge and so, so important. And I think, as educators, we're listening, and hopefully as society, we're listening too. But certainly the educational
Mhm.
community, like we talked about, is always listening to the youth because that's why we're in this space to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good to hear. Yeah, I mean, that's such amazing advice, and I think a very powerful note to end on. So, Eric, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your experience and insights. I really appreciate it.
Likewise, Arnav, you're doing some great work, and yeah, I look forward to hearing the podcast and also just reviewing some of the others that you've done.
That's all we have today on Voices for Climate. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow the show and share it with someone who cares about building a more sustainable future. And I'll see you all next time. Thank you.